Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for taking the time out of your day to join this webinar. Today we'll be sharing a preview of a new report authored by the wonderful International Longevity Centre titled Trial and Error, Supporting Age Diversity in Clinical Trials. It's the first time this work has been shared publicly, so welcome to an exclusive. I'm Emma Thorpe, Chief Commercial Officer at RBW, and we're joined by an expert panel who will be discussing the project in more detail, sharing their unique perspectives and experience. Before handing over the floor to the panel and the ILC team to introduce themselves, I want to give a brief introduction on who RBW is, the project, and its background. RBW Consulting is a life science specialist search and recruitment business with a unique commitment to purpose and giving back to the industry we work with. We're driven by the knowledge that every person we place, and in turn, everything we do contributes to better outcomes for patients. From introducing the right people to support our clients, to directly enabling more informed decision-making through investment in patient-focused initiatives, like the one we're discussing today. Our RBW Impact Programme sees us contribute pro bono to work that fulfills an unmet need, whether that's a shortage of knowledge, data, discussion, or practical implementation on important issues within the sector. In 2021, we funded a project in rare disease, exploring the psychological impact that a rare disease diagnosis can have on children and their families, which we're really proud to say has since been really well utilised across the healthcare system and within a policy setting, to the extent it was cited as a key reference in the latest Rare Disease Action Plan from the UK Department of Health and Social Care, published in February of this year. For our second project, we're keen to support a project that had equal significance. And through our liaison within our networks and the sector, and latterly our discussions with the ILC team, we felt that when it came to addressing diversity and representation in clinical trials, a hot topic, no question, the inclusion of age-related considerations was falling somewhat short. Against the backdrop of United Nations Decade of Healthy Aging, it felt like the right time to do more. So I'm delighted to be sitting here a few months on and to introduce what I already know is going to be a valuable piece of work. The more we can identify and share practical solutions, the more progress we will make. And it's our hope that this insight shared with you today via the report that Esther will speak more on shortly will sit alongside excellent efforts of others to make real change happen. So that's plenty from me. I'm now going to hand over to Paul, Chairman of the Global Longevity Council, Trustee of the ILC, and ex-Chief Medical Officer of Pfizer. Paul, please could you introduce yourself and the ILC?
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Paul Vandenbroek, and as was mentioned, I'm a trustee at the ILC. I also have a long experience in pharmaceutical and clinical development. And I've done this in different countries around the world. My latest position was Chief Medical Officer. So I'll give you a brief introduction to the International Longevity Centre UK, or ILC, and also talk a little bit about the importance of this report. So the ILC is the UK's specialist think tank on the impact of longevity on society in general. The ILC was established in 1997 as one of the founding members of the International Longevity Centre Global Alliance, which is an international network on longevity. And in that time, ILC have built excellent working relationships with the pharmaceutical industry, the partnership with Roche, but also collaborations with GSK, Merck, Gilead, Amgen, Sanofi, Pfizer, just to name a few, make us really well placed to deliver this report and meaningfully contribute to the clinical trial space. With this report, ILC aims to advocate for older patients by demanding more representative data when testing the medicines that they are prescribed. Investing in diverse clinical trials is an investment in our future health. We have a population that is simultaneously growing and aging. More older people could mean more demand for medicines and interventions, and we can take action now to ensure that older people in the future are receiving the best possible care. In other words, we really want to translate increased longevity into increased healthy longevity. The trial data that reflects the diversity of people who will later be prescribed the drug is better for patients, but also better for the health service, for the economy, and for our collective well-being. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Paul. Now I'd love for the rest of our panel to introduce themselves. Miles, may we start with you, please?
Thanks very much, Emma, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Professor Miles Whittam. I'm Professor of Trials for Older People at Newcastle University, and I work at the National Institute for Care Research, Newcastle Biomedical Research Centre. Much of my research as an academic focuses on conducting trials for older people, particularly trying to improve and prevent muscle. But I've got a long-standing interest in improving inclusion of underserved groups in clinical trials, including older people, those with multiple conditions. And I'm also interested in improving how we do trials by improving trials methodologies so that trials are fit for purpose to include older people.
Wonderful. Thank you, Miles. Mike, please may I hand over to you next?
Sure. Thanks, Emma. Hi. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Mike Keynes. I'm an operating executive with Thompson Street Capital Partners, working with their healthcare division, making investments in the health services, clinical services space. I've been in the clinical research industry for a little over 20 years, most of that time working on development and execution of clinical trials and clinical trial operations. I would say most notably, maybe for this call today, I've had a fairly direct experience and was fortunate enough to have been an early adopter and early exposed to decentralized clinical trials, but also have a background in the financial aspects of clinical trial operations and funding, and looking forward to going through our discussion points today on recommendations. So thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mike. And Rosemary?
Hello, everyone. My name is Rosemary Lackaroo. I'm the founder here at Acon IQ. We are predominantly a patient recruitment and retention company, focusing on supporting the pharmaceutical and biotech medical device industry. I have worked in patient recruitment and retention for over 10 years now, in supporting in multiple therapeutic areas globally, really focusing on diversity and inclusion as a key part of what we do at the centre, as well as improving clinical trial experiences and adding that collaborative approach to working with patients and the general public. Nice to meet you all.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. And last but not least, Dave, please. Thank you.
Yes, hello, everyone. I'm Dave Velacer, Chief Medical Officer at Rigo Pharmaceuticals. I started my career in academic medicine when I moved into the pharmaceutical industry. I've now worked in both large and small pharmaceutical enterprises and worked across multiple different therapeutic areas, but probably over the past 10 years, mostly in the oncology space. So I'm particularly interested in this issue because with an aging population in the United States, and I am a baby boomer, we see more and more individuals at more advanced age with cancer. So including those individuals, even in early phase clinical trials, to get an understanding of how age affects response and safety data, I think is very important. And I'm interested to hear what people have to say in terms of how we may remedy the paucity of patients that we actually do enroll in any clinical trial above the age of 65.
Wonderful. Thanks, Dave. Thank you, everyone. I just think it's wonderful that we've got so many different perspectives on this panel. So I know it's going to make a really good discussion in a very short while. But right now, I'm going to hand over to Esther, who's been doing an incredible job of leading this project and authoring the resulting report that's going to be published imminently. So perhaps, Esther, a short introduction to yourself, and let's hear more about the project, please.
Great. Thank you, Emma. So my name is Esther McNamara. I'm a Senior Health Policy Lead at ILC, and it's been great to work on this collaboration with RBW Consulting. So we at ILC are a life course organisation, which often means we are working on issues that are specifically related to older people, but the benefits are for all age groups. And the objective here, as with most of our work, is delivering better outcomes for our ageing population. So demographic change throws up all sorts of challenges, and exclusion of older people from clinical trials is one that's been brought up again and again in the clinical trials space, in the medical research space, but without sufficient action or resolution. The key problem being that older people are taking a large proportion of prescribed medications without being included in the trials testing those medications to the degree that we might expect. So the report that we decided to put together to investigate this was came about in the following way. So we undertook some desk research, and which supplemented a roundtable of 15 expert stakeholders, a couple of whom are on the call today, which is great. And then a further 11 conversations one-to-one with other expert stakeholders, just collating a real range of views and perspectives on, the extent to which this is a problem, because we're a think tank. As far as we know, this has rumbled on for a long time. What if it's not a problem at all? That older people and younger people are similar enough that this is all of us over nothing. But that's absolutely not the case. So the range of experts we consulted with included professionals from pharmaceutical companies, regulators, academics from a range of disciplines, including geriatrics, pharmacology and public health, contract research organizations, and patient advocacy professionals, among others. And so the report that will be available in a few days' time collates all of those findings. It picks out the common themes and concerns that were raised across this research process, but it became clear through that process that every trial and every patient's journey through their trial is entirely unique. So our job was to make recommendations that were useful and practicable for everyone across lots of different trials in different areas of medicine and across geographies, which would all have their own regulatory and legislative frameworks that these recommendations would have to fit in with. So the first thing to do was to establish what is currently getting in the way of older people's participation in trials. And there were 4 key themes that emerged from that question. The first being the increased cost or perceived cost that is incurred when developing more flexible or accessible trials. The need for clean data, which sounded like a good thing to me. I was like, why wouldn't you want clean data? Upon further investigation, it sounds like the requirement for clean data can often remove a lot of the nuances and the complexity that we need when we're testing using diverse cohorts, which obviously throws up the whole range of different issues and considerations when you're dealing with big groups of diverse people. The third would be arbitrary exclusions from trials, although it is less common for trials to have a strict 18 to 65 age range in their protocols. This occasionally still happens, and informal exclusions in clinical decision-making based on the patient's age or medical history are still taking place. And the fourth was practical considerations that we as a life course organization are very familiar with. So questions of accessibility, patient understanding of the trial process, how patients learn about the trial to begin with. So there were so many big questions that I couldn't wait to dive into with our expert stakeholders and in this report. So the report has made 8 recommendations, but we only have time to discuss 4 of them today. So you'll have to see the report for the full research and the recommendations that we make. And I'll just take a quick moment now to give a whistle-stop tour through 4 of them to set out the discussion that we'll have today and how we arrived at each recommendation to begin with. So the first was to replace the current international guidance ICH-E7, which is the scientific guidelines for studies in support of geriatric populations. So obviously these guidelines were set out 3 decades ago, and huge technological developments have been made since then. Huge cultural shifts have been made towards patient-centered care, and we are more aware now than ever that we're living in aging societies where more older people are presenting with more healthcare needs for longer, which makes this whole question of better guidance and better. So there's a growing urgency for high-level discussion to decide what age diversity means in practical terms and how we will achieve this. So having this, set out at the highest level is a big step, and maybe not the first step, but really important to get us all on the same page. So the second is increasing incentives for age diverse cohorts. So the point being really, it needs to be easier to create an age diverse environment than to create an environment that isn't age diverse. So we need to be sidestepping commercial imperatives to use healthier, younger, and therefore cheaper participants. And a lot of the things that we're recommending aren't cheap. So patient and public involvement infrastructure, additional efforts to recruit underrepresented groups, none of these things are free, but they are an investment in a growing market that could have significant returns from a commercial perspective. The third recommendation I'd like to briefly mention now is the prioritizing gathering age-related data across all trials. So this is happening to varying degrees depending on where and the area of medicine, the regulatory framework, and then what happens with that data afterwards. Because if we have the best age-related data really setting out how this medication affected people by age group, but it sits in a database that no one else can see, there's a limited utility to that. So there's a lot of exciting things that can be done in terms of gathering and sharing this data to help us identify best practice and also areas that need more work on age diversity. The fourth and final recommendation I'll mention now is investment in consistent PPI, patient and public involvement, that I mentioned briefly earlier. So one of the key themes across all of the conversations we were having is that patient and public involvement is the best way to ensure that trials are accessible and appropriate for the people you're seeking to involve. And I'm sure that our panelists will have lots to say about each of those, so I will stop there.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Esther. That was a really good intro to the report and an explanation of some of the recommendations there. So I know that the audience are going to be really keen to hear from our speaker panel now. So I'm going to go straight into this by inviting each one of you guys to just share some short opening remarks, really, to Esther's summary on the report, and knowing that you've also seen the full reports yourselves. So once we've heard from each of you, let's move forward into a more free-flowing discussion. But Miles, perhaps you could kick us off with your brief initial reactions.
Thanks very much, Emma. So as a professor of trials for older people, you'll be unsurprised to hear that I think it's great that we've got the report, and I'm always very pleased to see the spotlight shining on this. And I think the report very nicely encapsulates what the problem is, the fact that we haven't made as much progress as we would have liked to see over the last 30 years since ICH E7, and nicely outlines the barriers. And I think that there are a couple of things I wanted to sort of put on the table early on in the discussion. I think that the focus on age is important, but I think as we continue our conversations, we need to not lose sight of the fact that it's not just age alone, it's all the things that come along with age. We need to take those into account when we're thinking about how we make sure that our trial populations are truly represented. So keeping a focus on multiple long-term conditions and keeping a focus on frailty is important as well. The real danger here is that if we just have a very narrow focus on age alone, we're going to end up with trial populations that are full of incredibly fit older people that still won't be genuinely representative of the people that we see and that I treat in clinical practice. And that brings sort of challenges that we can explore further. I think the other sort of thought that I wanted to put on the table early on is really for us to focus on how we move forward, and the report makes a number of helpful recommendations. And I think what it's really telling us is that we can't tackle this problem through a series of isolated initiatives or siloed initiatives. We need a broad spectrum approach all the way across regulators, researchers, industry, and patients as well, if we're going to make progress. All of the barriers and the challenges interlock. So I think that's something else that we perhaps can bring out in presentation. I think the final thing, I suppose, is a reflection on me and my colleagues as researchers, and that is that we need to find better ways of designing and delivering trials for older people. That is our job in this space. And if we can provide colleagues in the commercial sector with the tools that make it easier for them to design and deliver trials for older people without massively inflated costs, I think we're much more likely to get traction on this tricky issue, and we can help regulators to develop roadmaps to make this happen.
Great, thank you, Miles. And Rosemary, what are your initial thoughts?
Absolutely. I completely echo what you said, Miles. Absolutely. I think the report has come at a very, very good time, especially with the regulators around the world globally who are really working hard and collaborating with us in the industry to improve diversity and inclusion in clinical trials. You know, just go into the FDA in the US, new laws, regulations in diversity planning now, and also the MHRA in the UK in the last 2 weeks have also introduced new legislation on, you know, bringing UK to be the centre of excellence, in clinical trials again. So I think the report is really positive in that it focuses on practical recommendations as well, which is needed. We need to move past the conversational piece and really think about what we can do practically as an industry with the public and trial participants to improve the clinical trial experience. And I really like the fact that the report focused on this in a holistic way as well. And for me, you know, being a patient recruitment and retention expert and worked in the field in a long, you know, for a long time, I really, really like the fact that we look more about co-creating, collaborating with the public now, and building out a clinical trial design that's built for them and by them. I would say it's been very positive. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. And Mike.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity. And I think for the individuals that are attending this webinar and those that are watching it as a rerun on YouTube, once the report's out, I think as has been spoken to, there are a lot of great items within the report that takes a comprehensive and as mentioned by Rosemary, practical approach to meeting these needs with regard to involvement of age populations. What jumped out at me and really resonated from my background and perspective, and for those that are participating in this webinar, that's really what you're going to get is different informed viewpoints based on our individual experiences. I think a couple of things. One, it does speak to at some level the main goals and focus of clinical development and the idea of trying to improve that process without losing sight that the process itself is to drive forward safe and effective medications. And so on the one hand, you don't want to overly burden any of that development by placing rules and constrictions in place arbitrarily. On the other hand, there's always an opportunity for constant improvement. And so I think, as Esther mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, you know, one of the paradoxical recommendations around the cleanliness of data really has to do with more of the simplicity of the approach to data that's being collected to expedite the clinical trial itself. And so the more populations you have involved, the more comorbidities or medications that they're taking, all of this, you know, has to get analyzed by statisticians and may unveil areas that were not previously known for areas of risk. And so, you know, those are areas where we look to, you know, to advance the process itself and make it as inclusive as possible, both in ethnicity and in age. But the goal is still obviously to progress forward medications for a large segment of populations that need those areas and those pharmaceutical supports. What I would say in addition is that what I really appreciate about the report, and I think we'll have a discussion on today, is how we can take examples of previously performed successes in this drug area as well as others, and see how we can use those as guide points, in addition to incorporating advances, whether they're advances in thinking by regulators, advances in focus by pharmaceutical companies, or advances in technology. And so what really resonated to me the most out of the recommendations, two of them that we're going to talk about today, numbers 2 and 3, around the regulator involvement and potentially the economic involvement, and then the data collection. And I won't talk to it as much, but everyone will, I'll put a primer out there for number 7, which you won't talk to too much today for time, but just as a teaser for everyone on the report, there are some tie-ins to recommendation number 3. And so I know we'll open it up a little bit later, but from my perspective, particularly on the regulator and the economic areas. I think there are things in the United States and in Europe particularly where we can look to the PRV or priority review voucher model and maybe make some of those same applications into looking to expand age cohort and age cohort focus. And also particularly more in the United States, looking at areas like reimbursement for drug use. If the label and the underlying trial is more inclusive of both ethnic and age-related populations, that may be able to drive incentives to not only conduct strong research, but areas that are more comprehensive, and that will fuel additional drug development in the future. So looking to those two areas, and then certainly for numbers recommendations 3 and 7. With my background in decentralized clinical trials, understanding how we can deploy those technologies and those approaches into not only all populations, but particularly how we could deploy that and leverage those learnings and those tools, for this age population as well. So I think looking forward to a lively discussion here today, but also would very strongly recommend individuals from this webinar and in the replay download the report, because there is a lot of information in there.
Awesome. Thanks. Really appreciate that, Mike. And Dave, could we get your first reactions, please?
Yeah, I'm going to echo things that other people said, but I think that what Mike was just talking about, carrot and stick, are very interesting. The FDA has had regulations for years and years and years, suggesting or advocating that we enroll age-diverse populations, and for drugs that will be used in people over 65 and over 75, that we should have data on those individuals when we file an NDA. However, it's not required. Every one of those regulations has a big disclaimer saying that, even though there is a special population part of a package insert, you can skate by that fairly easily and still get a drug approved. So how do you actually get people to be incented to do that, to do those studies and get that information into a package insert? And I think what happened with pediatrics in engaging or studying children with medications that were felt to be appropriate for pediatric diseases is an excellent example of that. By putting in the pediatric rule and both requiring the drug companies commit to getting data in that population, as well as incenting the companies if they do that, I think we could probably do a similar thing for the aged. The other thing that I do want to mention is that I've worked in a number of different therapeutic areas across my career. In some instances, I've been very successful working with a patient advocacy group, going to the American Diabetes Association, going to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation to really, have people behind you, Food Allergy Network. And that helps if you're looking for someone with a rare or uncommon disease. I don't know of how, I think we haven't figured out how patient advocacy groups can just work for engaging more people over the age of 65 and 75 to be referred to clinical trials. I haven't seen that in the studies I've run. We've not had an age limit. We have tried to leave very loose eligibility criteria to include a larger population. They're just not referred to research studies to be done. And we talked about this earlier in the call. I don't know. I don't have a really good idea of how we can do that. So I'll be interested to hear what people think.
That's great. Thank you, Dave. Thank you. And finally, over to you, Paul.
Yes, thanks. The advantage of being last is that most of the important things have already been said, and so I'll be quite brief. But one of the things that I would like, so having had an experience of running clinical trial programs in different parts of the globe, and also based on actually a project that I implemented, where we looked at at the internal piece of this. So within a pharma company, what do we need to do in order to get the company to really focus? In this case, it was more general diversity, not only age, but also race and ethnicity and gender, because there's still an issue with gender in some indications. And how can we make sure that then we really ensure the inclusion of a diverse population in clinical trials? And so we went in different steps, and one of them was really to reach a clear understanding of the or awareness of the clinical research teams of the importance of this, which is not always very well understood internally. And I think some work to be done there. And so then we started off with a clear understanding of what the actual makeup of the population is that has the disease, and to reflect this as much as possible in the clinical trial populations, including in the early phases of development, because the sites that are used for phase 3 are based in part on what we do in phase 2, for instance. But also separately from the makeup of the population in terms of age and gender and race and ethnicity, also understanding of the expected differences between those different populations, and perhaps with the view to enrich the clinical trial population at certain populations. And then we set out clear numeric goals based on the population makeup and the expected differences between populations for the clinical trial teams to hit. And that has been mentioned earlier, arbitrary exclusions. We did a full review of the protocol design to find any inclusion criteria, including age, but also disease, that would automatically exclude certain age ranges, for instance. And then investigator selection and site selection is incredibly important in this as well, because certain sites will go with certain types of populations, for instance. And then we also developed a software program where clinical trial teams could actually see in real time what the age, ethnicity, and race and gender composition of the clinical trial population was as the trial was progressing, and also as the overall global development program was progressing. And then they could make adjustments. And that brings me to then some of the issues that I think we need to discuss perhaps a bit more in depth. And one of them is there's a lot of emphasis on cost, and justly so in the report, but I think time to approval and access is very important as well. And you may be aware of the case of at least one pharma company that delayed recruitment for certain age groups in the their COVID vaccine trial in order to be able to include sufficient older adults in their population. So there's a cost to be paid in terms of time to approval and access for patients as well, if we do this right. The other issue that perhaps we can have a bit more discussion on, what are the numbers needed actually to draw valid conclusions from the number of older adults, for instance, that we have included in the trial, because if we don't reach statistical significance, it might be difficult to draw actually valid conclusions from the data that we collect. And then the last point that I would like to make in terms of incentives, I think Mike mentioned PRV, but also we mentioned the pediatric extension. That's really something that I think we should look at as well. The pediatric extension, I think, has worked very well, and with some exceptions, but in general it has worked very well. And it is something that pharma companies focus on very much. So perhaps a patent extension related to generating data in different age categories in older adults might be the way to go. So those are my comments.
Fabulous. Thank you. I can already see that there are so many places we can take this conversation, and I feel like the next 30 minutes or so of group discussion that we have is never going to be enough. But we will do our best and get through those 4 recommendations that we've cherry picked. Obviously, reminding everybody, please do go on and read the report. There's so much more in there that sadly we don't have time to get to today. But everyone who signed up to this webinar will have the report link emailed over to them as soon as it goes live. So also, just before we get into conversation, I just want to stress that as part of this webinar, we do want to have audience questions. There's a chat function that I'd really like to draw everyone's attention to. I think we're all very Zoom literate now, so all aware of where that is. But what would be incredibly helpful is if you're wanting to direct your question to any speaker in particular, please do pop that on the question so I know who to direct it to. But yes, thank you very much. And I mean, I think a really good place to start is maybe on the first recommendation we pulled out around some new guidelines to replace the ICH E7. It feels like starting at a high level, and the need to talk kind of top down guidelines for improving age diversity in trials is needed. I mean, in particular, this report was published 30 years ago in 1993. So would anyone like to kick us off with this one with some comment to get this discussion started?
Maybe I can jump in. I think this is a very important recommendation, and really one that is important to follow through on. And the main reason for that, in my view, is that, first of all, it clarifies the expectations for approval of a drug, which is really what we're working towards. And second, also, and perhaps more importantly, it levels the playing field. Because if some companies are really following through on really reflecting the age range of the patients that will eventually use the drug in their clinical trial programs, they may be at a disadvantage with other companies in the same therapeutic area, perhaps, who do not. And so that has implications in terms of time to approval. It has implications for the types of side effects and drug interactions that are mentioned in the label, and so on. And so I think the ICHE7, it sounds quaint now when you read ICHE7 and you see a minimum of 100 older adults in a clinical trial. I mean, you know, if statistically that doesn't mean anything in clinical trials. So I think a rethink on ICHE7 is really important, if only to level the playing field so that the drug developers and can really follow the same guidebook, as it were, and one not being at a disadvantage, perhaps, in doing this.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'm really aware as well that we've got a really international audience dialing in today. So I'm just curious, kind of asking from my lay perspective, do we feel like, in the absence of any up-to-date guidelines, that there are differences across different countries in the way that we're developing drugs and looking at these trial cohorts, particularly related to this? If I could throw that open to Dave, maybe.
Yeah, I've done trials in Europe and China, and you know, our eligibility criteria didn't vary based on the country that we were running the trial in, unless there were local regulations that required something. But I don't think that that's ever contributed to a difference, you know, in the age of the populations recruited. I'm going to ask Rosemary if I can put her on the spot and just ask her what her experience is in terms of what kind of advocacy groups can you even approach in general about increasing awareness of the importance of participating in clinical trials for people over 65. I have a lot of experience where it's pretty clear to me that these patients, at least in oncology, are often not referred to our research sites. And that may reflect a lot of bias within the healthcare system. But, you know, on the flip of that, what kind of advocacy groups, you know, should we be approaching and saying, you know, we need to raise awareness?
Absolutely, that's a very, very good question, Dave. I would say it varies from country to country, but the most important part is really understanding the age population's journey within the healthcare system and who's their first to go, right? When they have any issues, is it a family member? Is it a member of the community? And kind of map it out and work it that way. And there's many, many international, local level, and, you know, just city level organizations that are pretty much overlooked actually in our industry in terms of reaching out and supporting and networking and partnering, because they have a lot of insights that would be very valuable to us in the industry in terms of developing the clinical trial experience and developing a protocol, understanding their needs, right? So it could be socioeconomic information that could really help. I know from my experience working with nurses, actually in general hospitals is a major, major key aspect if we're talking about advocacy, because when patients are leaving hospitals, they actually tend to ask nurses a lot of everyday life questions that the nurses may not know or be able to help. But they have so much, and I'm talking from immigration questions, from housing questions, you name it. But in saying that, there's so much insights there that would help us understand the needs of the population, and when we're designing and planning protocol. And going back to the advocacy groups, there's numerous, and they vary from country to country globally, but there are numerous, and I would say a lot more attention to detail and work is needed to focus on the local level organizations and people of influence and community leaders, in bringing them and co-creating with them and speaking with them and better communicating with them. I would say a lot more work is needed, but there's massive opportunity that's unmatched at this moment.
So if you were going to initiate a real push to enroll more patients over the age of 65, over the age of 75 in any clinical trial, I'm not even speaking about specific disease.
Yeah.
Do you think that nurses and allied health individuals get enough training, aside from physicians, the people in allied health that are probably engaging more on a day-to-day basis with patients in terms of encouraging them to look at the opportunity to enroll in a clinical trial?
Absolutely. And it's an engagement and outreach measure, right? So educating the nurses, it may not necessarily be training them per se, but is raising the awareness of the clinical trial that's taken place, that's been conducted, giving them information so that they can, disseminate the information and share that with people. They see numerous amount of patients, so that opportunity has been missed. But I'd say just having that engaging and outreach strategy being implemented in the trial design phase and reaching out to nurses, there's lots of work. And then there's other stuff that nurses could potentially be key stakeholders actually in the clinical trial process as well. That's another thing that needs to be looked into.
Yeah. So some centers are really, really good at this. And I think also just sharing best practices amongst centers can be incredibly helpful. It's a bit of a hackneyed phrase, but it really works. And the levels of engagement of some centers are really fabulous, while others are almost nowhere, right? And so that I think might be very helpful as well.
I think.
Rosemary.
No, I just wanted to just end on the planning side for us as an industry is really key and important, and the strategizing. When we look at the patient population, that could mean many, many different things. It's not just about the disease area, it's about their lived experience as well. We need to do that to plan better, and then that would really help drive us in the right direction of who and what type of organizations we should be engaging with. Is it family members? How should we really co-create and collaborate with them? I think at the planning stage for the industry is really, really key. And that would definitely set us on the right, journey to identify the best way to really engage with patients. Yeah.
So are you aware of training and awareness programs that have been specifically designed for allied health individuals to get them to focus on this amongst all the other things they need to focus on when they're dealing with patients, and have that conversation with an individual who may have progressed to the point where they would benefit from participating in a clinical trial?
I won't say I'm aware of any programs per se, but I have definitely worked on campaigns, I would say, where we really strategize, and that was part of our planning, to go and disseminate information to private healthcare practices, general practitioner practices, and really going like grassroots approach almost, right? In engaging with them, speaking to them, giving them trial information, and also, little things like lunch and learns, right? Held at, the practices, and giving them that opportunity to invite, potential patients that they see or spoke to these lunch and learns events on the site levels. I think just to land on that, grassroots approach is always important. It shouldn't be left behind the whole digital world that we're in right now. That sense of community and just being there and having that personalized experience should not go unmissed. It's still really needed.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Rosemary. Oh, I think that it's definitely everything that you're saying there, the sort of the starting off with some guidelines and then moving along into creative ways of doing things and actually looking at how you're talking to people generally is super important. I'd love to also look at the incentivization that regulators could provide to encourage the greater age diversity in trial cohorts. I think that's maybe one of the second recommendations that I know sort of from our prep call, we kind of led into this and got very passionate from the first one into this one. And I know, Mike, this is a one for you, certainly.
Yeah, I'm happy to start off. I know I think we have a pretty healthy viewpoint from all of the panelists on this too, as you mentioned. I think to phrase it as well, or to frame it, you know, and the report speaks to this as well. And I know Paul talked to this also. You know, it's, I guess, to center it, it's not so much that it's active, you know, actively preventing individuals from being involved in clinical trials. It's everything from setting specific inclusion/exclusion criteria to principal and investigator selection and offering the trial to, you know, particular patients. And the pharmaceutical companies, obviously, as Miles spoke to, also thinking about the developmental timelines, you know, to shepherd this through to approval. So it's a very complex landscape that all these are going in and sort of ending up or resulting in where we are today with maybe less engagement in elderly cohorts or more advanced age cohorts. One of the going through the report and then some of our discussions, one of the things that really caught my attention was, you know, as I mentioned, the priority review voucher program. And so for those that are not familiar, PRV was intended to be progressed in areas so that clinical treatments and drugs could be researched and advanced in areas in which there was a small number of patients who would benefit, or in which you know, the payer that would ultimately buy this drug wouldn't be over a large population. So these were relatively underserved areas or small population areas, with the idea that upon drug approval, the developing company would receive a voucher to expedite their next drug into the system. So and what ended up happening, and why I think it's a fascinating you know, sort of guidepost to look at, is it then created a marketplace where drug companies could take a development forward for an underserved area, and then upon approval, they could either maintain that voucher for anything else at all, whether it's underserved or not in their pipeline, or what then drew a lot of attention is they could then sell the rights to that to another drug company to, you know, for a certain dollar amount that was unrestricted, and then receive, you know, money in exchange. The developing company received money, the purchasing company received an opportunity to apply that voucher to an area of their own research. And I think, you know, whether it's something similar to that or not that gets created, something that's semi complex, but that really pulls in, as Miles said earlier, or I'm sorry, as I think Dave said earlier, both the carrot and the stick is helpful for the industry. Because if we just depend on altruism, unfortunately, that doesn't always get us there. It gets us most of the way, but not all the way to the level that we're speaking to. And so when we look at incentives, whether that's done through regulators, through more formal processes, or through, at least in the United States, third-party payers, you know, who may, you know, be supported at a government level by providing more reimbursement for drugs that have, you know, meet certain patient guidelines in their research. I think those are areas that would absolutely move forward to help, you know, further advance what we're trying to do and what this report is aiming to initiate dialogue on having a more diverse patient population. So I know that's a lot there, and I know that there are probably others that are looking to jump into this as well. But I think it's a fascinating recommendation, and thankfully, whether it's the pediatric aspect that was discussed earlier or the PRV, you know, there are ways that we've seen successfully deployed that could be applied here as well.
Fantastic, thank you. Would anybody like to chime in on that one?
So I might just sort of add to that. I'm absolutely sold on the idea that we need carrot and stick, and I think, you know, we've had carrot up to now, and carrot has been sort of munched, but the donkey hasn't really moved. So I do think we need both. I suppose it's to firstly say that we've got to be very careful with stick, though. You know, if we're designing structures that mandate, inclusion of certain groups of participants, we've got to be very careful about how we describe that and how we mandate that. Otherwise, we are going to end up with, the boxes being ticked, still not getting the groups of patients in trials that we really want to see. And I think there was a point in that you raised in the report about this. If you say, right, we're going to mandate that we bring people over the age of 70, you might end up with a whole bunch of people between 70 and 75. Now, that's not actually where the issue is. And there's been some nice work out of Glasgow University recently showing that actually representation of younger old people in studies is actually pretty good. But where we're really falling down badly is in the older old and particularly the over 80. So it is possible to pay lip service to structures that mandate inclusion of older people, but still not end up with a very representative population. So I think for me, some of this is about creating some incentives and some mandating, but also making this easier. Because I think, as we've heard from Rosemary and others, this is not easy at the moment. It takes longer to bring people who are older into trials. They are more complex, they're more heterogeneous, costs are higher. So we need to find ways to bring those costs down and to shorten the time that it takes to do all of these things. Part of this is about skills, and we sort of touched on this earlier, and I think there is a definite and specific skill set around engaging with older people, supporting older people as they come into. Some of that, I think, can be taught, but some of it comes with experience. And of course, you're in a vicious circle here. If you never recruit older people into trials, you're not comfortable with recruiting older people. So we need to find ways, whether it's by bringing people into areas of clinical practice into the trials community or other methods to make that happen. There's an interesting comment that somebody's raised in the questions as well that meshes with this, and that's around digital exclusion. But this raises the issue about flexible approaches. And I think one of the things we need to remember is that older people are very heterogeneous, and the older you get, then the more different from one another older people become. So one of the keys here is to design structures and trials that support that heterogeneity, that we take really flexible approaches, that we're not constrained by recruiting people one sort in one way or from an electronic registry that excludes people who are not literate. Give them lots and lots of options. That's how I think we make it easier to bring many older people in trials and to bring a really broad spectrum of older people. Well, and I mean, Rosemary, I don't know if you want to sort of comment, but that sort of then raises issues about intersectionality as well, doesn't it? In that it's not just older people, there are specific groups of older people who are a particular risk of exclusion. Make sure that our solutions are fit for purpose for bringing all of those groups in as well.
Absolutely, I echo everything that you've just said, Miles. And it's not looking at, age disparities in an isolated way. Honestly, it's much wider, much broader than that. And that's why understanding the patient population holistically is very important. Absolutely.
I also think what type of data do we actually need, I think is important to look at, because for certain drugs, there are more issues in older people, and they may be known or not known and perhaps should be studied. But what type of data do we really need to tease out those differences? And does it really mean that we need to include large numbers of older adults in different age categories in the full phase 3 program, or are there ways to look at this in different types of trials, for instance, as well? And so that's part of the flexibility, perhaps, that should be built into the discussion on ICH E7, I think. And the other point that I would like to make is how much is enough, right? So in terms of how many patients do we need to reach valid conclusions? Because if we have limited numbers of patients in certain age categories, we may find differences that are perhaps not real, and we may be falsely complacent, right? So there's no difference, so we're good. Or on the other hand, we might find the difference that if we had sufficient numbers of patients, perhaps that would have not shown. So those issues I think are important to look at as well.
And Pol, thank you, because I think that really nicely is kind of we're bleeding into recommendation 3 and 4 here with some really great discussion. But I think it's that prioritizing age-related data in trials is really interesting. And I wonder, kind of, we've got the benefit of you in the room and Dave in the room from 2 very different size and scale organizations. Like, what are the differences when you're looking at that data between running a trial at a Pfizer to a Rigor, and does that affect this recommendation in any way? I'd love for you both to comment on that.
So Dave, why don't you go first?
Oh, you're on mute, Dave.
There we go. Yeah, so obviously, we've spoken to this before. Small biotechnology companies do not have unlimited resources to put into early phase development, and yet recognize the importance of this. I think, some of the things that I always think about is the mechanism of action of the drug. There's been a big boom in immuno-oncology drug development in the last decade. People over the age of 65, people over the age of 70 actually do have this clear evidence that they have waning immunity. So how an immuno-oncologic drug works in somebody 83 compared to somebody who's 53 could be very different, and it could change the risk-benefit equation for those patients over 75, over 80. So how you do that in phase 1, I think as a small biotech would be virtually impossible unless you were to design, maybe a phase 1b program we specifically required that you get some safety data and some evidence of mechanism of action or pharmacodynamic data in those individuals. That comes at an expense that I think some small biotech companies cannot actually afford in phase 1. So, it's a quandary that we really can't solve. And then the other thing, and I'm just going to mention this in a study I'm running right now, had a patient come in for screening. I was very surprised. This woman was over 75, and she had a biopsy that did not report a marker for the tumor type she had that was a eligibility criteria for us. And I was actually shocked because it's actually a tumor marker that would sort of direct her therapy were she not in a clinical trial. So we agreed to pay for the biopsy and to pay to get that histologic data. But I was kind of surprised because it made me think, well, whoever her original treating oncologist was, he or she wasn't bothering to get this information, which kind of made me think that maybe they didn't think treating this subject or this patient was as important or as critical as a younger patient, where you really would want those markers to, give them targeted therapy. So, again, comes back to the expense that, a small company can incur even to confirm eligibility when a patient is referred for a trial.
Yeah. From my perspective, first, I just want to clarify, I'm no longer with Pfizer. I left Pfizer at the end of last year. I'm not representing any company on this call. And in terms of the perspective from larger pharma, one of the things to think about is that resources are not unlimited, unfortunately, whatever people outside think. And one of the reasons is that the top pharma companies in terms of size have at any one time up to 100 or more clinical trial programs running simultaneously. So the decisions are more related to trade-offs between investment in different areas. And some of these decisions are really very difficult to make. And so that's why I think it's important to, as I mentioned in the beginning, to have a level playing field so that not only externally between companies, but also internally, so that those trade-offs that are made between different clinical trial programs can be made on a level playing field with different requirements. So having been involved in the implementation of a program to increase diversity in the clinical trial population in a number of our clinical trial programs at the time, I can tell you the discussions were very difficult internally, and people really wanted to know what the eventual payoff would be. And interestingly enough, not only financially, but also in terms of what it means for patients, in terms of potentially delayed approval timelines, for instance, or having a label that may not reflect true differences in treatment outcome or in drug safety. And so that's more the type of discussions that are going on. And again, cost is important, but actually time to approval and access for patients is very important as well.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think it's great. It goes to show we can't make sweeping generalizations on anything at all. Every trial, every company is different. So thank you. So I'm conscious that we have our fourth recommendation still to speak about, with about 5 minutes until we have to go to audience questions. So I'd really love to spend this last bit of time talking to you all about development of consistent patient and public involvement. And this is such an important element that we involve patients and families, as Rosemary has already spoken to. And I know that this is a particular area of expertise for you. So maybe we can just talk a little bit more about that and what good looks like, and if there are things to consider when engaging older patients.
Absolutely. And I'm really just going to touch on quickly the last recommendation, because I did want to just have one last quick comment, and that was just with regards to data collection. I think across the field, we need more data transparency, because there's been a few questions about how much is enough, where do we start, et cetera, et cetera. I think we need more transparency across the field. We need to start from somewhere in understanding what that looks like, both quantitative and qualitative data, right? So I just wanted to touch on that quite briefly, but just moving on to the fourth recommendation, which I think is key. It's key in everything we said, because all of us, we can gather, we can come up with solutions and strategies, but at the end of the day, we must ensure that we are co-creating clinical trials with patient and public involvement, because we cannot make decisions on behalf of strangers' lives. We need to understand from their perspective what their needs are, And this is where it's really key, because there are different, there's completely different ways of recruiting patients, trial participants nowadays. We have decentralized trial models. The clinical trial industry has really, really changed. And we could attribute that a lot to, COVID-19, where we had to re-strategize, be innovative very quickly. Right, we had to respond. But what's key is what that has done for the industry. It's made everyone very intentional about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and it's completely changed things on its head. And in that, also the public, grew a lot of more, attention into this whole clinical trial space, because they were watching us as an industry, race to look for a vaccine to save everyone's lives. So a lot more people know about clinical trials now. There's a lot more, interaction and engagement, and it got a lot more people, interested and wanting to take part. Not everybody wants to take part in a clinical trial. We as an industry have to be honest and accept that. But a lot of people would, if they just knew about it. There's a lot of bias in industry from what you said, Dr. Dave, at the clinical trial that you was working on. Clearly there was some oversight, patient, and overlooking that because of their age. That's a form of bias, So there's so many different things that we have to look at on the industry level to improve, the way we all interact with the public ourselves, but really focus on how imperative and important it is for us to include PPI in clinical trials, is that we can negatively come up with a plan that actually may not be suited for a certain patient population in a certain country. Right? We have to look at things holistically. Different patient needs globally, locally, demographically, socioeconomically. We cannot just plan for them. Not one size does not fit all in clinical recruitment. That's one key thing that we have learned. And how do you do that? Is you It's very, very easy. You speak to the patients and healthcare providers as well. They're in the communities, they're speaking to patients daily. We bring everyone, key stakeholders from the public side to the table, and then we work with them to create a clinical trial experience that suits everyone. And we think about different needs, maybe, you know, costs are a huge part, but we cannot think, okay, let's run a decentralized trials because everyone would want that. No, actually what we found from the aging population is they want to get out. They don't want to stay at home and do a trial. They actually want to meet someone face to face. But if we only learned that because we spoke to them, and we learned that, so that we found that wasn't actually the best solution, right, for them. So it's imperative, it's key, it's important to include the patients and the public and get them involved in the development of clinical trials. It's happening. You know, the industry is intentional about it. We're starting to see it happen with the FDA new guidelines, and also MHRA in the UK and other regulators across the globe. But now we have to be more intentional and practical about how we actually deliver that. And the best way to do it now, we're in a new time where we are involving the public a lot more in what we're doing. It's not such this shroud of secrecy anymore. It's open, it's honest, and that's where transparency is key and it's needed.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So yeah, take home is like, let's all stop making assumptions and talk to people. Right. So important.
Right.
Now, we are running out of time and do need to go into the questions. And one thing I do want to stress is, I know we touched on intersectionality earlier, and age just not being the only part of this conversation. The report does highlight some really interesting areas there also. So I just want to stress that I wish we had more time, but just wanted to get that piece out myself. So on to some audience questions, and just reminding everyone that there is that chat function there. So if there's anything that you want to pop in there, we will do our best to get to these questions. But let's start with our first question, which is, to what extent are you planning to recruit elderly populations? In other words, do you expect to recruit elderly with a lot of comorbidities, taking a lot of medications? Is it safe or useful to include such patients, as it might cause variability and multiple DDISs, I believe?
Can I perhaps answer that as an end user of the research? So if I'm sitting in my clinic and I'm seeing an older person who's got multiple comorbidities and is taking lots of concomitant medication, I absolutely want to know, is that drug safe and is it effective in the person sitting in front of me? And if we don't recruit those people into clinical trials, I won't know. I won't be able to have a conversation with that person in front of me. I won't be able to come to a decision with them about whether this drug is right for me. And that's not unimportant, because there have been some very prominent examples where drugs which we actually know are pretty effective now in older people have been badly underused because the clinical population have not been convinced that they are safe or effective. So ACE inhibitors in heart failure is a classic example where they were introduced in the mid-90s. They were tested in people in their mid-50s, and geriatricians looked at this and went, we are not prescribing these. These make people fall over, these make people's kidneys worse, they are dangerous, and we are not going to give them because they have not been tested in the people in front of us. So for about 15 years, then older people with heart failure were quite badly undertreated because the evidence wasn't there to clinicians in that decision making. Trials were eventually done incorporating older people and people with lots of comorbidity, and we found actually that ACE inhibitors were relatively safe, were highly effective in even very old people. But that's just an example of what happens if you don't bring the right people into trials. You end up actually doing patients a real disservice, not just by perhaps treating with medications that are ineffective or harmful, but actually denying them benefit, because there's psychology involved in this as well.
And
wonderful,
also,
thank you.
Oh, sorry,
Rosemary, go on.
I was just going to quickly say, and also the whole purpose is drugs should be developed for the people, the populations it wishes to serve. So there's no way we can leave them out. There's no way, because they will need to use the drugs in the end. Sorry, is what I wanted to say.
Absolutely, thank you. And then we've got another question here. Does the Information Supply Act, distinctive to put my teeth back in. Does the Information Supply Act act as a disincentive to older patients? The data I have seen in ALS is that younger patients are incentivized by giving them the ALS FRS, but older patients are turned off and do not want the data. Is there a need to make protocols more flexible? Feels like one for the medics among us.
I would say I think it depends on the individual. I think, you know, there are older people that I talk to, and they're desperate for information actually, and they really, you know, like the detail, and they like us to share results with them. And there are other people who, if you present them with a 20-page patient information leaflet, say, well, I'm sorry, I'm just not reading that, or they say, no, I don't want to know what the results are. So I think flexibility is the key here, in terms of both protocols, but also of all trial processes, so that we can give people options for what's right with them. It goes back to the conversation we've just had about, well, where do you conduct trials? Some older people love coming to a trials unit or a trials research centre. It gets them out for the day. They get a nice taxi ride and they get to meet everybody. Other people, you cannot bring them out of their house. So why not design a trial that you can deliver in a person's home or in a research centre? And that way you get the best of both worlds.
Wonderful, thank you. And then I'm afraid there's another question for you here, Miles. You're really getting the spotlight today. So following all the important points you've all raised, older subjects included in clinical trials should be reasonably similar to those who would be treated with the drug in clinical practice. How to make this happen? In other words, would sufficient guidelines, e.g. a new version of the ICH E7 suffice? Or specific legislation is needed, e.g. similar to pediatric legislation that's been approved in the EU some years ago. In the legislation finality, so does that legislation help solve the problem?
I mean, Antonio knows more about this than I do. So the gentleman asking the question is a world leader in this area. But what I'd say is we've clearly covered some of this ground. I think there's an opportunity there to move just beyond ICH E7 to look at the ICH regulations more generally, and I think there are opportunities there for reworking some of them to make trials in general easier, and I think that will have beneficial knock-on effects to make trials easier for us to include older people. Do we need specific legislation? Well, we might do. I think it will depend on the jurisdiction to a certain extent, because I think, again, you know, what's right for one section of the world may not be what's right for other sections of the world.
That's fantastic, thank you. And I know that we've touched on this as well during the conversation, but going back to the question about digital exclusion, so Debbie would like to ask the panel about the importance of avoiding that. Many studies only allowing online registrations, which allows digitally engaged patients to look for research. Studies that have electronic info available or a website. How important is managing digital exclusion of the recruitment of patients over 65? I feel like that is firmly in Mike's wheelhouse.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think you know, obviously there are a number of experts on this panel as well. I mean, I guess from my perspective, what I would say is it is sometimes an assumption that there's a homogeneous population inside these age groups, and as Miles and others have spoken to earlier, that's not always the case. So I'm sure that you know, the approach of, or the concern of, a digital exclusion, you know, does apply to some individuals and in this age range, and probably doesn't to others. And so I think it is ultimately what I've seen work really well, whether it's in decentralized or in traditional clinical trials, is providing the most avenues possible for individuals to be engaged with or be aware of a clinical trial. And so exclusively keeping it online, I would say, will absolutely create restrictions in many cases, regardless of the age. I think it's, you know, there's some that prefer to intake their information in other areas. And so I think it's a great point. I think from my perspective, it speaks probably to a larger issue of creating several channels in which individuals can participate in these trials, and not just exclusively one.
Fantastic, thank you. And with an eye on the clock, I'm going to be really cheeky and take the last question myself. But I would really love to ask all of you guys. I'm always really mindful with these kind of reports that it can really feel like it's a very steep hill when there's all these recommendations lined up next to each other. And while this is a really important document, and it does absolutely highlight the scale of the challenge that the ILC have done absolutely beautifully, it's obviously really important that there's no action too small when it comes to progress. So I'd just like to ask each of you, if you could pick one small thing that everybody listening to this does when they go back to their desks or their labs or their hospitals, what would it be for each of you? What's the one small call to action? And Dave, you're first on my screen, so I'll start with you.
Okay. I'm going to go back to something we talked about earlier in the teleconference. I think most individuals, most of us who are running clinical trials, and obviously the consumers of clinical trial results, like Miles and other practitioners, we want to provide the correct information. We want to provide the information that will be helpful to practitioners in terms of, should I use this drug for this patient or not? But I think that the thing that I keep getting stymied by is the fact that I don't, to date, I'm not aware of any large-scale initiatives that would engage allied health professionals in starting to raise awareness in their patients, in their elderly patients, about when or what they should think about in terms of enrolling in clinical trials. And we may not be able to get by the bias of all individuals, and I think busy physicians maybe are probably the worst people because they're aware of the trial but just don't have the time to or patients to discuss that. But I would really like to see coming out of this a recommendation of how we could engage allied health individuals in raising awareness about clinical trials, which first means raising awareness about it across the board with allied health individuals, social workers, nurses, etc.
Fantastic, thank you. So everyone just have one more conversation. And Miles, over to you.
So my plea to everybody when you go home is that the next trial protocol you look at or you design, you take it back to the human level and you say, my 90-year-old mother, my 90-year-old grandmother is sitting in front of me. Could she take part? Would she be allowed to take part in this clinical trial? And if she is allowed to, permitted by the exclusion criteria, practically take part? Is it designed in such a way that she could bring her dodgy hip, her heart failure, her osteoporosis, her 10 drugs, and she can get in a taxi or somebody come and see her at home? And if you can say yes, they're halfway there, because if you don't design a trial so that older people can take part, you can't deliver a trial and take part. That's my plea on an individual level. Go back and look at the protocol that you're working on at the moment and ask if your grandmother can take part.
Thank you, Miles. And Mike?
Man, Miles is a tough act to follow. Your grandmother sounds like a champion, by the way, but with all those issues, but still getting by. I guess, yeah, I think similar to that last comment, and maybe I'll refine it to a smaller point. Just look for one thing, literally just one thing that would improve that protocol. I think there's a tendency when we get into a focus of areas, and especially with people that have such great backgrounds, we want to change the entire world. We want to change the entire landscape. I think that's too much too fast in the wrong direction, and it actually paradoxically prevents much change at all from taking place. So whether it's a protocol generation, whether it's as a PI, maybe thinking out a little bit, one step outside of on a concentric circle to patients that you would introduce clinical research to, I would look for a small and incremental change to start that you can then build from, would be my short-term goal. Longer term, I think the other thing that I see a lot, especially on the decentralized and the technology side, is there are a lot of potentials that could be deployed into clinical trials, potential technology, potential approaches to nurses in the home and free transportation and digital and websites. And I think to me, the most important thing is to understand that you don't have to do everything. And so I think, if you just on a protocol basis, try to find one thing, or if you're a PI, try to find one extra patient that you maybe wouldn't normally speak with about a trial in this age range. And on the larger issue, I think it's understanding that you don't have to deploy everything. So that would be my recommendation and walk away.
Thank you. The marginal gains. And Paul?
I'm going to go the other way. I think
Excellent.
it's one thing that we can do is really, in a sense, keep our eyes on the prize, and in whatever we do, think about how we can make those improvements. Not only, I mean, it's important to make small incremental improvements. Don't get me wrong, and I love Miles' example. But I think it's important to kind of look at this also from a more general perspective. And how can we make sure that in everything we do, and with all the stakeholders that we need to involve, which include patients, but also the general public as well, how can we make sure that in the end, the clinical trial populations that we study reflect the population who is actually going to take the drug, and will make it easy and relevant for healthcare professionals who will prescribe or administer the treatment, can be confident that they're doing the right thing for the patients.
Fantastic, thank you. And Rosemary?
Yeah, that's going to be hard to follow because everyone has completely
Sorry, you got the worst spot there.
I think I would say it's never too late. It's never too late. Ideally, take all the recommendations in the report from the planning stage so that you do have the time to eliminate any recruitment challenges further along down the line, and that increases time and increases the investment needed to conduct the clinical trial, not to mention protocol revisions and things like that. What I would say, it's never too late in the sense that if a trial is in a rescue phase or something is not going right, there's still time to engage with the trial participants and gain some insights from them to help, understand, where things are going, and understand the trial participants' experience, which could help save something, earlier on in the funnel, is what I would say. So I'd just like to lead with, it's never too late to consider patient and public involvement within the clinical trial. I tried.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much to all of you. There's so much ground to be covered, and I feel like you've done an amazing job of getting a lot in a very small period of time. So thank you. I'm very grateful to all of you, and incredibly grateful to the ILC for producing such an important and impactful report. So I'm going to hand over to Esther to just close, mentioning a couple of the ILC events that are up and coming. And thank you all very much. And goodbye from me.
Thanks,
Emma, and thanks so much to our panelists for contributing their time and expertise to the webinar today. Thank you all of you for attending and for your insightful questions. It's been a really fascinating discussion, and yeah, I look forward to circulating the report when it's available, and I look forward to hearing everyone's thoughts and seeing how much we can achieve in this space, because that there's a lot to do, but the inclination, the energy, all of the things that we need, we have. So I'm really excited to see what happens next. We've got another slide just with our upcoming ILC events. There's not a whole lot of overlap between these events and the event today, but yeah, so we've got some activities at the G20 and G7, and a lot more information on our website about this project and others. But I think the final slide is just thank you. Thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.
Yeah.